What's up, motivators? Taren here. There's a really interesting phenomenon when you start looking at finish times for short races as you go up to long races. What you tend to find is that there's a significant difference between male and female finish times at shorter races. And then as you get longer and longer and longer, female times end up becoming closer and closer to male times. And what we're seeing in ultra endurance events lately is athletes like Courtney Dauwalter going and beating up on men. Hey, that's awesome. Now, why is this the case that in shorter races, males tend to do better, but in longer races, females might make up for their genetic disadvantages with muscle mass and overall strength and things like that? What is the underlying factor that allows them to actually narrow that gap? Well, there's a study that just came out recently that figured it out, and I think it can actually apply to understanding why we might be encountering challenges as athletes and how to train for it in our training plans.
My name is Taren. In my 20s, I was overweight, unfulfilled, and couldn't even run to the end of the block. Over the following years, I found endurance sports, lost 65 pounds, won age groups, raced world championships, broke records, and trained and learned from some of the best athletes and coaches in the world. You too can use endurance sports to change your life and accomplish your fitness goals. You just need a system that's meant for us amateurs who want to be our best while feeling our strongest and healthiest. My company Motive offers that system, and I want to share some of the tips from it today.
So this is a study here that I found that has just come out. It was with one of our favorite podcast guests and researchers, Paolo Puccinelli, who has long been studying the predictors of endurance sports performance down in Brazil. And what they looked at was the performance, physiology, and morphology of female and male Olympic distance triathletes. Essentially, what they did was they took a whole bunch of male Olympic distance triathletes and then female Olympic distance triathletes, looked at their finish times, and then looked at a whole bunch of physiological factors like VO2 max and muscle mass and fat mass and all of these things, and said, well, what are the key drivers that are different between the two that might be causing the differences in times? And we've got this chart here that compares females to males in what they found. So in muscle mass, yeah, it was no secret that males were more muscular than females. Fat mass, females tend to carry more fat, whereas males tend to be a little bit more lean. So the males again had an advantage in what would commonly predict better athletic performance. VO2 max, well, because the males had more muscle mass and less fat mass, that makes sense. More muscle mass tends to mean that your VO2 will go up. So the VO2 max measure was better in males than females. Maximal aerobic velocity, this is how fast you can go at your aerobic velocity. Well, because the males had more musculature, they were able to propel themselves faster at that same aerobic effort level. So the males beat them out there. But where it became interesting was in aerobic endurance. This is where they actually found that females beat the males in the measure that they used for aerobic endurance. Now, what's interesting is to understand what that actual measure of aerobic endurance is. The measure that they used here in this study for aerobic endurance is called the respiratory compensation point. And this is actually even hard to Google what it actually means, but I'll try to lay it out here. And this is a very commonly used measure that researchers will look at to assess the ability to perform an aerobic endurance event for a long period of time successfully. And this is the measure where females did better than males. So generally what it is you get an athlete into a lab, you put a mask on them where you can measure their gas exchange and how much CO2 they're expelling. And what we've got is VCO2, so this is the amount of gas they are breathing out, and then VE, this is how many breaths they're taking. And typically, what is seen is a fairly straight line, and then there's a point at which, boom, it spikes up. Now, that intersection of one line versus the other, that right there is the respiratory compensation point where females did better than males in this study. Now, the thought that I start interpreting here is If this is where females are performing better than males, they are just generally better at getting deeper and deeper into intensity before they start hyperventilating, before they start taking a lot more breaths. Now, the really interesting part about this that I find kind of fascinating is you hear a lot of anecdotal reports where you hear, oh, she's just a diesel engine. She can go super far, she can chug along, seems effortless for her, but she's going fairly fast, but can't hit that real top end. You put her in a sprint race, gonna be fairly average. Men, on the other hand, tend to be the opposite, where they've got big power, really good at short bursts, lifting heavy things, but generally you don't hear as many men suffering with the issue of being too much of a diesel engine and not being able to have enough of a high end. Kind of confirmed here, because what they found is in this group of athletes that generally the male athletes clearly had more power, more top end, more speed, more raw speed, but the ability to just be a diesel engine and chug it out was where females excelled. And I think this is why we're seeing a lot of females excel at the longer and longer distances, because by this study, there's an indication that shows that they might just be more of a diesel engine. Now, how can you deal with this in your training? What I find most athletes are really good at, this is males and females, is being in this middle intensity zone. This is like zone 3 and zone 4. This is moderately intense, but the downside to it is that it's not so intense over here in high intensity that it's forcing the body to adapt. It's also not so aerobically focused that it's building the aerobic engine. This is for both males and females. Now, what we like to do in all of our training plans, because I don't think this is a male or female thing, I think that this is an age thing, that athletes just aren't good at going in this low intensity zone 2 kind of training zone, zone 1 training zone. They also tend to think that they are really good at going intense, but if they're spending all their time here in the middle, when it's time to go intense here in the zone 5, the effort level just isn't going to be very intense. It's not going to be super sharp. And even if it feels sharp, it's not going to be as sharp as if you spent a lot of time down here in zone 2, because this zone 3 has been shown to actually beat up your nervous system, so that when you get into these really intense zones, you can't absorb it or you can't hit it as hard. So I think for both males and females, it just comes down to a proper training plan that is going to push you into your uncomfortable spots. Your discomfort zone is where you grow as an athlete. And that means that we're spending around 80% of our time down here in low intensity training, and this is going to help the male athletes become more of a diesel engine, but then we're also spending probably 10 to 15% of our time in the high intensity training. We can talk in another video about why I don't believe in strict polarized training, and I do think that this middle zone shouldn't be ignored completely, and in the pyramidal model of training that we do actually do a lot of that middle zone, because you need to know how to be good at tempo. But anyway, we'll save that for another video. And that 10 to 15% will really help with the females hitting that top end, becoming a little more sprinty, a little bit more powerful. Also, this is where strength training comes into play. Because while males need to include strength training to make sure that our hormones are propped up as much as possible, females also need to do that, and they need to work on muscle definition, muscle tone, muscle mass, top end power. So instead of interpreting this as, well, males need to train one way and females need to train another way, I would actually say everyone needs to train well. And generally, the principles of good training are like 98% agreed upon between most physiologists, and almost every study comes out saying the same sort of thing. The final 2% that is slightly different from athlete to athlete or gender to gender, yes, for some people it might make a significant difference, but for the vast majority of the bell curve, the majority of the people out there, they just need to follow generally good physiology. And while I do believe that females definitely have some unique requirements with their nutrition, with just being kind to themselves at certain times of the month if they aren't able to push to a super big effort level, maybe taking some additional days off that males don't have to worry about, I don't think that saying everyone is a unique flower and everyone has to figure out their exact unique physiology or else you're not getting the most out of your training, I think that that might lead to paralysis by analysis and leave people just to be confused and going like, well, what do I do because everyone's saying something different? And I don't think that that's welcoming to the sport where really 98% of what applies to one person is going to apply to another person. That final 2% isn't going to make the difference between a podium and a non-podium. It might just make tiny, little, minuscule, almost imperceptible differences in performance. And I think that simplifying things as opposed to overcomplicating them is what we need to do better as, let's face it, content creators online. So my take on all this is just emphasizing the importance of a well-designed training program that is pushing people into their uncomfortable zones on the edge of being very easy for 75 to 80% of your training and then very, very hard for a small little bit of it. And maybe the females out there can go and kick some ass of some of the fellas out there at the longer distances. Do it. Thank you for watching, motivators. If you're looking for a training plan that incorporates these methods that is as good as a one-on-one coach but as inexpensive as doing it yourself, check out our Motive training app that covers triathlons, running races, duathlons, swim runs, and cycling events. There's a link in the description below where you can check out your customized training plan for free. Also, if you'd rather listen to these tips, we also publish these videos in podcast format on the Taren's Motive Method podcast, so you can check that out. And if you don't want to do either of those things, but you found this video helpful, hit us up with a virtual high five by smashing the like button below. Later, motivators.